Lecture 8, World War II. After World War I, there was a concerted effort to make certain that this war would be the last world war ever to occur. For this reason, the League of Nations was founded in 1919, a year after World War I ended. A main promoter of the League of Nations was the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who was in office from 1913 to 1921. Woodrow Wilson believed that diplomacy was the most effective policy to prevent the outbreak of war. As stated in his 1918 14 points, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Across the Atlantic Ocean in England, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain adopted a related policy called appeasement. This foreign relations policy, directed towards dictators, was strongly opposed by Winston Churchill. Churchill replaced Chamberlain as prime minister when it was evident that the policy of appeasement had failed, resulting in World War II. The war officially ended about a month after nuclear weapons were dropped in August of 1945 by U.S. manned airplanes on civilian cities of Japan. We will end this lecture with a few works of art, whose purpose was to encourage public devotion to the two great dictators of the war, Hitler and Stalin. League of Nations. A peacekeeping league was mandated by the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. The following year, the mandate was fulfilled by the League of Nations founding. Prior to World War II, the three major Axis powers and belligerents of World War II, Germany, Italy, and Japan, all belonged to the League of Nations. Italy and Japan were part of the 1920 42 founding nations, and in 1926 Germany became a member state. According to the laws of the League of Nations, all member states, including the three just mentioned, were to work collectively in preventing wars from occurring. Interestingly, despite President Woodrow Wilson's commitment to the League of Nations, the U.S. Congress never approved the U.S. to become a member. According to its constitution called the Covenant, nations are to, and I quote from the League of Nations, to promote international cooperation and to achieve international peace and security by the acceptance of obligations not to resort to war, by the prescription of open, just, and honorable relations between nations, by the firm establishment of the understandings of international law as the actual rule of conduct among governments, and by the maintenance of justice and a scrupulous respect for all treaty obligations in the dealings of organized people with one another. The breakout of World War II in 1939 indicated that the League of Nations had failed in its peacekeeping mission. A main reason why this league was an ineffective peacekeeper was that it lacked military might. This meant that it was incapable of enforcing peace even if disputes were submitted to it. Policy of appeasement. As stated in the introduction to this lecture, similar to the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the British politician Neville Chamberlain strongly believed in the effectiveness of diplomacy. He even mistakenly thought that Adolf Hitler could be appeased through diplomatic means. For this reason, the policy he promoted is called the policy of appeasement. When Chamberlain became the British Prime Minister, this is the policy that he acted according to when negotiating with Nazi Germany shortly before World War II. Taking advantage of Chamberlain's political naivete, in October of 1938, Adolf Hitler demanded that regions in Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, which had a German majority, belong to Germany and not to Czechoslovakia. Even though Hitler had no legal right to these lands, Chamberlain, representing Britain and France, chose to appease Hitler by supporting Hitler's demands. Chamberlain did so by telling the Czechoslovakian president that he had to give these lands to Hitler in order to maintain peace. Lacking the support of its allies, Britain and France, Czechoslovakia reluctantly gave in to Hitler's demands. In assuring people that this was the right decision, Chamberlain said this, and I quote, "The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler, and here is the paper which bears his name upon it, as well as mine." He then waved the paper to the crowd, and the crowd responded with loud cheers. And then he concluded, "Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I will just like to read it to you." Sadly, instead of guaranteeing peace in the future, Chamberlain's policy of appeasement caused Hitler to be even bolder and gave him precious time to further build up Germany's military strength. In the wake of public disapproval of his appeasement policy that was failing, in 1940 Chamberlain resigned. Winston Churchill then became Britain's Prime Minister and served from 1940 to 1945 and from 1951 to 1955. Churchill had vigorously opposed Chamberlain's appeasement policy. According to Churchill, trying to appease dictators like Hitler was highly risky and placed all of Europe in grave danger of being taken over by Nazi Germany. Churchill held that our difficulties and dangers will not be removed by closing our eyes to them. They will not be removed by mere waiting to see what happens, nor will they be removed by a policy of appeasement. What is your opinion? Do you think that diplomatic, non-violent measures can resolve major world conflicts, including conflicts involving tyrannical dictators? World War II. The beginning of World War II is commonly traced to September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and France declared war on Germany. Prior to the German invasion of Poland, the Empire of Japan had, since 1937, been at war with China. A year earlier, on November 25, 1936, Japan, along with its ally Nazi Germany, signed an anti-communist pact directed against the Soviet Union. This pact was the initial stage of the Axis powers of World War II, whose principal actors were Nazi Germany, the Empire of Japan, and Fascist Italy. After 1939, Japan's Second Sino-Japanese War became part of World War II, led by Nazi Germany. For the first few years of the war, the U.S. remained aloof until Hawaii's Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japanese in a surprise attack on December 7, 1941. The following day, the U.S., by an act of Congress, entered World War II on the side of the Allies. Prior to Japan's attack, Germany made a substantial military error by overextending its power in invading the Soviet Union, similar to Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Germany did so in accordance with the plan drawn up by Hermann Göring, a leading member of the Nazi Party. Göring wanted food and other resources of the Soviet Union to be directed towards Germans' people, even if this meant millions living in the Soviet Union starved to death. His plan, accepted by the Nazis in June of 1941, has been named the Green Folder. In June of 1941, another leading Nazi, Heinrich Himmler, estimated during a meeting with the SS group leaders that the population of the Soviet Union would be decreased by 30 million people due to starvation and other causes encouraged by the Nazis. Heinrich Himmler is famously reputed to having asserted, "I have no conscience, Hitler is my conscience." His willingness to allow and even encourage millions to starve to death is an example of the dangers entailed when someone's conscience is formed only by a political leader and not by laws reflecting the Creator, whom we are all accountable to regardless of race. In reference to Himmler's famous saying, Joseph Ratzinger asserts that, quote, "The destruction of conscience is the real prerequisite for totalitarian followers and totalitarian rule." Ratzinger argues that when the authority of conscience is no longer publicly recognized, then a totalitarian state will inevitably occur, since without a healthy tension between the state and the human conscience, the state and its leaders has no check upon itself, nothing to challenge its decisions. Fortunately, Göring's totalitarian Green Folder plan that Himmler was so eager to implement failed, since by invading the Soviet Union, the Nazis had spread themselves too thin. Within a year's time, the Allies were able to successfully rein in the Axis' drive to control ever more territory. Finally, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, followed by Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. Japan's surrender occurred after the U.S. dropped nuclear weapons on the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nazi and Soviet propaganda. According to this following Nazi propaganda, I quote, in the occupied regions of the fascist German Wehrmacht areas of the Soviet Union in May 1943, committed young Ukrainian women leave their home by train. And this phrase was accompanied by a picture of smiling Ukrainian women. In reality, though, Ukrainian enthusiasm for the Nazis was minimal, if at all, since the Nazis, in accordance with Göring's Green Folder Plan, were working towards diverting food grown in Ukraine, considered as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, to Germany, while deliberately allowing millions of Soviet citizens to die of starvation. And in the transcript, I provide other examples of propaganda, both of the Soviets and by the Nazis. God bless.